Located in the heart of the Sahel Strip is Lake Chad, which surface area has been divided by 10 since 1960. Climate change has caused the lake to dry out, and this has had a huge impact on the lifestyles and means of subsistence of the population for whom the lake is an essential source of water. Fishermen, herders and farmers from Chad, Niger, Nigeria and Cameroon, the lake's 4 bordering countries, face climatic variations such as drought, erratic rainfalls and floods, which leave many families unable to provide for their needs. The situation has been intensified by armed conflicts which have raged the region the last 10 years, causing cyclic and recurrent humanitarian and food crises. Today, 10 million people need daily life support in terms of food, water, refuge and access to health care. It's in this current context that the administrator of the UNPD, the United Nations Development Programme, Achim Steiner, and Mark Lowcock, the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, OCHA, recently carried out their first joint visit in Nigeria and in Chad. This visit is a call to the international community to pay more attention to the region's poverty, population movements, malnutrition and poor access to basic social services.
We started our visit last week in Nigeria, Abuja, and in the northwest of the country, where we met several of the actors for the projects and interventions in the field of humanitarian assistance, but also in the field of development. As you know, we have 2 functions in the UN nation system, and the General Secretary of the UN has given us instructions to reinforce the capacity of the organizations in the UN family. We want to work more together in the context of the crisis that need a humanitarian action, but also to see how to provide an earlier, clear and more efficient response, and to look at the root causes, the elements that explain why in a community, in a country or in a region we find conflicts, extremism and violence which affects millions of people in your country and the neighboring countries.
Under the theme, not fewer humanitarians but more development for resilient populations, the 2 UN officers started their visit in N'Djamena, where they met Chad's Minister of Economy and Planning and Development. The issues discussed included poverty reduction, regional development and the recent Berlin conference on the region of the Lake Chad Basin. The humanitarian action in the Lake Chad Basin is difficult, and this is due partly to the terrorist activity of Boko Haram, which prevents access to many areas. Chad is currently home to 446,326 refugees from Sudan, the Central African Republic and Nigeria.
Nous ne pouvons pas ignorer le développement et nous consacrer qu'aux urgences.
We cannot ignore development and focus only on emergencies. But if we don't deal with emergencies properly, we risk taking development in the wrong direction. So I explained that our current context, characterized by the security crisis, the humanitarian and financial shock, forces us to show more commitment for the humanitarian action, but also to angle resources towards sustainable and resilient development, which will give us a guarantee for the future, whether there is a humanitarian investment or not. And I commend the quality of the investment of these 2 organizations here, because you can't mobilize funding and you can't coordinate the humanitarian resource from home. Without the loan, you can't reassure all the investment in development. And we would like these 2 institutions to help build the national and local capacity in order to better carry this leading sector in development, which enables people to believe in themselves so they don't feel forced to leave, which enables people to be sheltered from all sorts of crises that would force them to go somewhere which might be worse, as shows today's migration flows.
Ce que génère les flux et la migration aujourd'hui.
Mr. Lowcock and Mr. Steiner also visited a nutrition center located in the capital N'Djamena, where more than 16,000 children suffering from malnutrition are admitted each year. This year, the center has recorded an alarming increase in admissions. In August 2018, the number of cases of malnutrition has increased by 57% compared to the same period in 2017.
This is a fantastic project which saves the lives of many children, but the bigger challenge is to prevent the children being in this position to start with. And in order to do that, the country needs to develop. Obviously, that's mostly the responsibility of the government and the people, but the international community can help, and what we would like to see over time is a stronger focus on development and the reduction of poverty so that we have fewer children coming here very, very sick who need life-saving help.
As UNDP, we are a partner to the government and the people of Chad since decades. So my visit here together with my colleague Mark Lowcock, the Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations, is in particular to learn more about what is working in terms of both the humanitarian assistance that the United Nations family provides, but also very specifically work that we do in the name of development, of supporting the people and the country of Chad in developing its medical infrastructure. And so the visit this morning here to this hospital is in part to focus on malnutrition. What we saw here this morning is one of the services that medical infrastructure and services can provide to the people, which is fathers, mothers can bring their children here and they can get an assessment. Are they malnourished? First question, very important, you need professional help. Secondly, what can I do about it if my child is malnourished? There are opportunities in terms of the kind of nutrition, the kind of supplements that may be necessary. And so we wanted to see how can we reduce child and infant mortality as a result of malnutrition and address also the long-term phenomenon of stunting. Children who are malnourished grow up being incapacitated physically, mentally. It's a tragedy, it can be avoided, and part of our development engagement with Chad is to reduce the number of children who are exposed to this danger.
Acute malnutrition is currently growing to an alarming scale in the capital under the cumulative effect of the crisis in purchasing power, which affects the population, and the seasonal food insecurity, which is particularly high this year. The chronic state of the crisis requires a new approach where humanitarian interventions are associated with development. In its support for the development in Chad, the UNPD office has been commissioned by the government of Chad to provide coordination, mobilization of resource, and the implementation of key pilot phases during the 2017 to 2021 period of the PAD-LFIT, the support program for local development and inclusive finance.
Le gouvernement a été très clair dans son plan national de développement.
The government was very clear in its national plan for development in that the rural development is a national priority, particularly in regard to youth employment and the empowerment of women. The UNPD has a budget of $14 million dedicated to resilience. Even though we know that Chad is vulnerable in many regions, we have paid particular attention to the Lakes region, which is an enclaved area. We have concentrated on resilience because we think that it could add to the humanitarian actions that other partners carry out in that region.
Dans nos activités, nous avons par exemple mis l'accent sur les échanges commerciaux des femmes.
In our activities, we have, for example, focused on women's trade exchange across borders. We also give the community of women practical tools like picks and seeds in order to carry out their activities. And I think that today these communities would like us to help them with the transformation and the added value of our support. We are currently in discussion with partners, and we can say that in the second phase of our program, we will try to draw lessons from what we have done these past 2 years and see with other partners how we can have greater impact on the community and enable a bigger transformation in human development in this region.
In Chad, among the Lake Chad Basin countries, we have activities, humanitarian and development, right at the lake shore and on the islands in the lake, and we will continue to be building up our presence and activities there. We have a much more open environment with some careful attention to security, but we'll continue to scale up the development activities at the lake. The challenges that we have at Lake Chad are typical of the challenges we have throughout Chad. It's a development emergency here in that we have nearly $600 million annual emergency response budget, which is mostly due to low levels of human development and the vulnerability that result from that.
The 3-day joint visit in Nigeria and Chad follows an international conference of donors on the crisis in the Lake Chad Basin, which was held in Berlin in the beginning of September, and during which $2.5 billion were promised for humanitarian projects for stabilization and recovery in Cameroon, Chad, Niger and Nigeria.
You see, for our partnership with Chad, one of the great questions is how in a vast country like this, where so many people are still not able to access basic services, where poverty and malnutrition, compounded also by internal displacement, by conflict in neighboring countries, is challenging the national economy, it's challenging the government also, and the people of Chad in advancing development. Our role as development partners is certainly one of providing advice, also financial support. But at the end of the day, it is a partnership with the government, because the international community, whatever its commitment and whatever its solidarity, cannot replace the power of the people of Chad and also the role of government in providing the infrastructure, in education, in health, but also in looking at the future economy of Chad. You now have mobile telephony in the country. It opens up tremendous opportunities for development also. Chad can leapfrog, as we say in English, sometimes a generation of otherwise very slow technology development in the medical sector, but also in education. This is where we as a United Nations Development Programme are proud to be partners to 170 countries, because we connect best practices, advances, lessons learned, and that is also our role here in Chad. Development is not replaced by humanitarian support. That's an intervention in an emergency. And so we are trying to understand in our journey together, how do we better combine the humanitarian response with also investing in development, in recovery and resilience. And the same is true here in our visit now on the other side, so to speak, of Lake Chad, because this is a region that the world is now paying a lot more attention to, because terror and violence and displacement and human suffering have become so strong that the international community is listening. It wants to support, but it needs to understand how to work with governments, with communities, to make development something that is not a failure, but a success story.
The humanitarian response plan for 2018 in Chad requires $544 million in order to provide for the needs of the 2.1 million most vulnerable persons of this country. Today, only 35.6% of the funding has been received. Furthermore, it is the goal of the government of the Republic of Chad to mobilize more than $430 million for sustainable development and resilience in the Lake Chad Basin. This investment will support the provision of basic social services and stimulate growth in the agriculture sector, on which depend the millions of people living in rural areas.